Oh, I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Lung Cancer Living Room. We're so happy to have all of you. As some of you may know, tonight's conversation is around personalized medicine, diagnostics, and treatments. And we are thrilled to be able to have Dr. Roy Herbst, MD, PhD, Chief of Medical Oncology from Yale Cancer Center and Smello Cancer Hospital, here with us tonight. So I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Herbst, and ask you to introduce yourself and tell us why lung cancer matters.
Yes, hi. So I'm Roy Herbst. I'm the Chief of Oncology here at Yale. I also lead the lung cancer program, and I've been working in this area for almost 25 years. And it matters because, when I was a fellow at Dana-Farber, back in the early 90s, no one wanted to work in this field. Everyone wanted to work on other cancers where there was much more progress. And I was very fortunate that there was a Dr. Tom Fry who encouraged me and Art Scarin to work in this area of lung cancer, saying we need to make progress. We need to see new drugs and personalized medicine. And I was very fortunate. I then went to MD Anderson, where the EGFR inhibitors were just about to go into clinical trial. So working with Kehan and John Mendelsohn, I saw personalized therapy at its best. And now, so many years later, we're seeing benefit. And that's what makes me tick, going into the clinic, running clinical trials, finding ways to help patients with lung cancer. And we're continuing to do that here in New Haven at Yale and throughout our entire network.
I'm involved in lung cancer because I was diagnosed myself 17 years ago. My mother died of lung cancer, my grandfather died of lung cancer, and my aunt and uncle died of lung cancer. So lung cancer has invaded our family in a huge way. So I started a foundation, pretty much out the chute with my family. And we're here today after all of these years. But I just want to point out one thing that Roy said, which is so exciting to me because it was not the way it was when I was diagnosed. More new therapies in the last 5 years approved by the FDA and actually approved very quickly by the FDA, really than the last 5 decades. An amazing amount of new therapies for lung cancer. So these are exciting times for lung cancer. And Dr. Herbst is going to tell us about some of that excitement tonight.
I want to start, Dr. Herbst, with a conversation about what are proper diagnostics. Can you explain biomarker testing, why it's important, and when a patient, why it's important when a patient's cancer is biopsied to have this testing?
Lung cancer is a very heterogeneous disease, and everyone with lung cancer has a slightly different genetic makeup. There are many people who get lung cancer who have smoked, but very many now who have never smoked. There are people who have had exposures to different chemicals. It varies depending on where you live. So it's very important, to know exactly what's causing that lung cancer to grow so we can attack it in the best possible way. When I started out, we used to have what we called non-small cell and small cell. We still do. Within non-small cell, the most common type, there's squamous and non-squamous lung cancer. But now we want to do a molecular profile. We want to know one of 7 or 8 genes, different parts of that cancer that are causing that engine to tick. Because if we can understand what's causing the cancer to grow, we can match it with a specific therapy. That's what we call personalized medicine targeted therapy. So it's very important these days to know that. There are also markers we look at that tell us about the immune system and the immune function. And these are all things that, as Bonnie said, are growing and escalating so rapidly. And it's amazing because now we can match the right person with the right drug at the right time in many cases, and that results in much more effective therapy.
is there anything happening in some of these other different types of lung cancer, whether it be squamous, to your point, or even small cell? Are biomarkers, starting to be identified in those areas?
Oh, absolutely. Many of these molecular targets, as you allude to, are in the non-small cell lung cancer, and specifically the non-squamous or the adenocarcinomas. But in the other types of lung cancer, squamous lung cancer, and in small cell lung cancer, now immunotherapy is really become a mainstay of that therapy. If someone has a squamous lung cancer, and most of those patients will have had smoked at some point in their life. Many of them will have stopped, but unfortunately, even after you stop, you're still at risk. Some may not have. The immunotherapy, checkpoint inhibitors can have a really, profound effect. And now small cell lung cancer, just in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen positive results for immunotherapy in small cell lung cancer. And by the way, a number of different markers that are beginning to portend therapies there as well. So the more we look, the more we'll find. And that's why clinical trials and research are so important. Because not only does that mean you're probably getting a therapy that's on the cutting edge, but it also contributes to the advancement of the field. We're continuing to learn. And I can tell you, I've seen this firsthand, having done this for nearly 3 decades. We're continuing to make progress. We're not enough yet, but we're continuing to raise the bar. And as Bonnie alluded to, with EGFR, and you alluded to with EGFR, we started using some of these therapies before we even understood the full molecular pathway and how they worked. I still remember meetings with Bonnie and the foundation, at our lung cancer meeting, 15 years ago, where we were seeing patients who were benefiting from these drugs, but we still didn't know why. And that's where we started collecting patients and bringing together registries. So progress is being made, and the foundation's had a big part in that.
I want to talk a little bit about the different types of biomarker testing, and I know we were discussing a little bit beforehand in the green room, if you will, before we went live, about comprehensive biomarker testing versus maybe single gene panel testing. Can you talk about the differences in both, and how what is your sort of gold standard when working with your patients?
Well, first of all, my dream, my goal is to get testing available to all patients, no matter where they live, who their physician is. And that's happening, but not as fast as we would like. We actually have a trial called the Lung Map, the Lung Master Protocol, which is a public-private partnership between the National Cancer Institute, the Foundation for the NIH, the Friends of Cancer Research. Many foundations help support it, the companies that supply the drugs. I would always advocate, if you can, to do a comprehensive profile. Why? Because there's not just one marker. There are now, at my last count, 7 or 8 different biomarkers that we can then now match that patient to a specific drug. So if you just do one, what about the other 6 or 7? And sometimes the samples are quite limited. So next generation sequencing and profiling is what I would advocate doing. Certainly the gold standard has always been to do it in the tumor, so have tumor tissue. But now we can even use blood. We can even, find those that circulating DNA and measure it in the blood. That's especially useful if someone were to have an abnormality, be treated with a specific drug, and then if something happens and they start to grow, the tumor starts to grow again, you can sometimes use the blood. In fact, we do it all the time, and then understand what's changed and how can we then match another therapy, add something on, a combination. Sometimes we use immunotherapy. So these are all things that we're doing in real time, and we're also using these tools in clinical trials. If you get 100 or 200 genes sequenced, there might be something that can be linked to an early phase trial. So patients can come in, and then we're not just picking something because it's available and we want to put someone on that study. We're matching them with science. We're increasing the odds that will work. And that's something I've seen throughout my entire career. Use the best science that you have in real time to raise the bar, help people do better with this disease. And now more than ever, we have to personalize the therapy. So I'm so happy with our Lung Master Protocol that's provided free, and that we have this open at 780 sites around the country, so patients can get this profiling. And that, by the way, that's patients from all ethnicities, socioeconomic groups. So we're beginning to get an understanding what is the distribution of these different mutations, so that we can get the right drugs throughout the world.
And Roy, could you talk about MAP a little bit more? It's my belief that, a patient can be on one clinical trial in this MET program, and if that particular portion of the trial fails that patient, they can actually move over into another drug within that uh, program,
Absolutely,
right?
Bonnie. And so last Friday, we put the first patient on the lung map trial on a new sub-study that targets KRAS. When I was growing up in this field, and still it's a tough target, KRAS was the holy grail. You could not attack it. There were no drugs. And now we have drugs. There have been data at the ISLAC, the International Association for the Study of Lung Cancer meeting, held virtually from Singapore in January. We saw amazing data, a phase 2 study, the CodeBreak trial, for these drugs. And we're now seeing these drugs getting and being made available to patients. But the problem is it's 12% of patients. So in order to find those 12 out of 100, we've got to make sure all 100 are sequenced. And this trial is putting them on that study. Now, if they were to then progress and fail that, we would then re-biopsy, and we would, or maybe a liquid biopsy, and then try to put them on something else. So that we're constantly trying to find something better for them.
So we've talked a little bit about upfront, diagnostics and the importance of biomarker testing then. And we touched a little bit on, further biomarker testing down the road, potentially at progression. Can you talk about why that's important? Because I think a lot of folks don't actually have access to biomarker testing at progression.
Right. Well, with the targeted therapies, and I think I must have treated my first patient with an EGFR inhibitor in 1997, if you can believe it, that long ago. These drugs, when they work, it's amazing. It's like putting a key in a lock. But the problem is these cancers are just so insidious and so smart. And what they'll do is they'll learn how to become resistant. So with time, the cancer will become resistant and it will start to grow. And at that point, it's my belief that if you can, either by biopsying the tumor, or this is where the blood biopsies come in, because sometimes the tumor's in a hard to biopsy place, you get some more sample and you resequence, and you might see the original abnormality, or you might see something different. And that's where the research comes in, the clinical trials come in, because we might have another drug to use. We've seen that in our own lifetime with epidermal growth factor receptor. The first drugs were gefitinib and erlotinib. And we then learned that about half the patients became resistant with another mutation, not that important for tonight, but I'll just mention it, T790M. But then there was a new drug, Osimertinib. And so that drug, not only was it able to attack that new mutation, but it also was a better drug in that it was more specific. There were fewer side effects, not without side effects, but fewer side effects. And then that actually resulted in our ability last year to actually show data that we could actually start using that drug in people whose lung cancer had been cut out or resected. So we've moved these drugs to the earliest stages of disease. So drug development has continually progressed because we rebiopsy, we understand resistance, and we're developing better and better drugs. I was just in the clinic this morning, and as you would imagine, many patients come in and they've been on some of these drugs and they've done quite well. But then, the tumor starts to grow, and then you have to make a difficult decision what to do next. And, certainly this is where the expertise, might come in of, the cancer centers. Since these tumors are still somewhat rare, there are major centers that might see more of these. And I often reach out to my colleagues for advice as well. I would say that if you have a tumor and it starts to grow, you want to try to rebiopsy it and see what's happening. And then you ask what are the other genetic factors in play, and then look for new drugs and new combinations. Now we have antibodies combined with what we call small molecules, oral agents. The antibodies being IV. Sometimes we can use a new drugging class. Occasionally we'll use chemotherapy. We're even starting to look at immunotherapy. But this is where I would ask your physician: do you have a clinical trial? Is there anything else that one could try? I'd go online. Advocacy groups are so important, both for information, but also to have a friend to talk to. There are groups called the EGFR resistors, and ALK and ROS1, and all the different groups. Many of those people are probably on this phone call. There are so many people who are living with this disease, and I stress living because that's what you can do with lung cancer now that couldn't happen many years ago because of the advances we've made. But still, one has to use all the resources available to him or her, to search out the best drug for their particular problem. And that often involves, checking with a colleague. Today, I spoke to a physician by email at Mass General as well as one at Memorial Sloan Kettering about a patient because, any doctor who you'd want to see should be reaching out and using the entire network. And, this is something that the GoTo Foundation and others are very strong at doing, bringing people together. Someone in that room will ask, is there something better? Is there something else? And by doing that, you're at least making sure you get the best standard of care, and hopefully you'll find something that can even push things a little bit higher.
Some really interesting information came out and some data came out around ASCO or at ASCO last year around the ADAURA trial and looking at biomarker testing in early stage patients. Can you talk a little bit about that, what that trial showed, and what's been happening since?
And that was a trial we started about 5 years ago. So the idea was, we were using these oral agents, these EGFR inhibitors, in the most advanced setting, and we were seeing some benefit. But as we talked about, tumors would become resistant. So the idea was, why not take these drugs and use them even earlier, in lung cancers where you've cut them out. But as you know, even if you've cut a lung cancer out, there's still a chance that it could become recurrent. So we were very fortunate the drug that we were studying, Osimertinib, the third generation EGFR inhibitor, was much more selective, meaning it had far less toxicity, it was a bit more potent, and it also had very good penetration into the brain. So that made this drug a perfect drug to use in what we call the adjuvant setting. And this trial that was multinational, it was almost 800 patients, across all continents. About actually 2/3 of the patients were treated in Asia, where EGFR is a bit more common. This trial basically took patients with stage 1, 2, and 3 lung cancer, all lung cancers that could be cut out. The patients then had the standard of care chemotherapy if they were appropriate, but then they either got this pill, the Osimertinib, or a placebo. And you might ask, how could you give someone a placebo? Because there was no standard of care. Nothing was being done. If someone had an EGFR mutation, we just watched them. And, about this time last year, I got a call that the trial had been unblinded. I hadn't expected to see the results for a couple of years. And that's because when they were reviewing the data for safety, they saw an 80+% improvement in those patients who got the Osimertinib, the pill, versus the control group. We expected the trial would be positive, maybe 20, 30% benefit, but 80%. So that actually resulted in the trial being presented at the ASCO. It went from the data to presentation just in 6 weeks. And it also resulted in a paper last October, and actually came out in August, but then it was published in October in the New England Journal of Medicine. So that, I believe, is how the paradigm is going to shift. Use your best drugs earlier in disease. Hopefully in that setting, the tumor doesn't have time to grow with enough cells to become resistant. So it's my hope that when this trial is finally reviewed in a few years for whether or not patients survive longer or not, it's my hope and expectation they will. We're still waiting for those data. But I will tell you, when we looked at those patients, so far fewer of them had disease that went to the brain, the liver and the bone, what we call metastases. So that's progress. And I would predict, it's not happened yet, but it's about to, that all the targeted therapies will start moving to earlier disease. And actually, we're going to see at ASCO this year that immunotherapy is moving to earlier disease. And that really takes everything full circle, because it's always been the case. And I mentioned at the beginning, my mentors, when I went into lung cancer, we were using chemotherapy back in 1994, but we always brought our best chemotherapy earlier. So imagine if we can bring our best targeted and immunotherapy, more active, fewer side effects, use it earlier. It really is a very exciting time to test these agents to help more patients.
Right. I'd really love you to tell these patients or explain to these patients a little something about chemotherapy, because so many are really, really terrified of going on chemotherapy. I'm sure you've got some patients too that say, oh no, I don't want to do chemo. But we have found that chemotherapy is still a very good player in the unique positions with these patients. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
No, I still remember around 2002 or 3, I was giving grand rounds at MD Anderson. I worked there for 13 years. And Emil Freireich was in the audience, who was one of the old guard who actually developed chemotherapies. And I talked about personalized medicine, and he got up and raised his hand and said, well, chemotherapy is personalized too. And he's absolutely right. Chemotherapy was developed to attack dividing cells, whether it be the DNA, the apparatus that allows cells to split and grow. It's just that it's not quite as specific as some of these more targeted therapies we have now. But chemotherapy definitely has its place in lung cancer. And one thing that we have to make sure people understand is chemotherapy with drugs like cisplatin and carboplatin, being used in patients who have had tumors resected or in combination with radiation, that can cure lung cancer too. So you mustn't forget that there are side effects. So you have to, sometimes people look at me, you're going to give me chemotherapy? No, it's part of the equation. We know now, which we didn't know 20 years ago, how to treat some of the symptoms quite well. Whether people always worry, will they feel sick? Will they be nauseous? We have great drugs for that. We understand the side effects. Some of the sores, mouth sores, and fatigue and other things. There's so many supportive care measures now. So I would always say, if chemotherapy is indicated, don't shoo it off. It can certainly help. And now we can combine some of these new therapies with chemotherapy. That might be the special sauce you need, a little targeted therapy with a chemotherapy. So it's still part of the equation.
You mentioned adjuvant therapy. Can you explain a little bit what adjuvant therapy is?
If you have a lung cancer, let's say an inch or 2 centimeter tumor in the lung, you cut it out, as you mentioned, there still could be as much as a 50% chance the tumor can come back. And depending on the size, the stage goes up to stage 1, 2. Stage 3 lung cancer has lymph nodes in the chest. And those cancers, even when you do what we call an R0 resection, that's fancy surgical terms for you get it all out. So you get it out with enough space between the margin, the knife, and the tumor that you can see that it's clear. It still can come back. So when you treat now for what you would call micrometastatic disease, the cells you don't see, it's basically like buying an insurance plan. That's where the chemotherapy comes in. And we call that adjuvant chemotherapy because it's therapy in the absence of any visible disease. And that has been shown to improve survival, but on the order of 5 to 10%, but it does improve survival. And I would contest that that's going to be used along with the targeted therapies, the immunotherapies, because it's good and it's standard of care and it should be, and it actually improves overall survival, but not nearly as well as we would all like it to be. And that's why I predict in the next several years, we're already seeing the ADAURA work where people now approved. The drug became approved last December, the Osimertinib, so you can use it in the United States. Now, there are going to be side effects that you wouldn't see if you were doing nothing. You're taking a drug, but I've been using it now in my practice. And now I think we're going to start using immunotherapies in this setting as well. We already are in stage 3 disease. I actually think stage 3 lung cancer is the most fascinating area because that's where you have a tumor, some lymph nodes. You use all your tools. You can use surgery, you can use chemotherapy, you could use radiation. And then about 2-3 years ago, there was a trial called the Pacific trial. And I know you're both in California. So the Pacific trial actually then used durvalumab, used an immunotherapy after and showed, a 50% improvement in survival. So we're using all of our weapons. The problem is we have to understand when to use them, how to use them, and that's where the personalized medicine comes in. The biomarkers, what's happening with the immune system, what's happening with the cancer and the targeted platforms. And it's really exciting. But, my goal, as an academic physician at Yale, working with the National Cancer Institute, the Lung Map, is to make sure this is available to everyone. And hopefully with programs like this, people will go online and they might seek a second opinion. And what's amazing? We can do video consults now. This has been such a horrible year, but I now have a very nice iPad sitting on the desk next to me. And 2 or 3 of my visits today in the clinic were by video doing other opinions. So I think that's going to help raise the bar so more people will learn about these issues and seek the right care.
There's also something for these earlier, surgical patients called neoadjuvant therapy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. That's fantastic. And, I always thought of that as, we learn a lot from a neoadjuvant trial because we're giving the therapy before the surgery. So as opposed to cutting the tumor out and then giving the therapy, Now we give the therapy and then cut the tumor out, so we actually can see the results of what we did. And about two and a half years ago, Drew Pardoll and his group from Hopkins and the group from Memorial had shown that a drug called nivolumab, one of these checkpoint inhibitors, in about 20 patients, could basically shrink many of these tumors to the point where the surgeons would be amazed. They'd say, I'm operating on a tumor, and the tumor would be almost completely gone. And they'd actually look under the microscope and see that there were very few, if any, living cells. But that was a small trial. This Checkmate 816 that was just presented at the American Association of Cancer Research by Patrick Ford, what this trial basically did is it had about 160, 170 patients in both of the different parts of the trial. So it was a large trial done at multiple sites. And half the patients got chemotherapy and then surgery, and the other half got chemotherapy plus the immunotherapy, the nivolumab, and then surgery. And incredibly, in those patients who got the immunotherapy at the time of the operation, a quarter of them, there was no tumor anymore. Anything that they removed was completely dead, versus in the group that was in the control, only about 1 or 2%. So very few. So I think, that still has some ways to go before it becomes standard of care. We need to see that that's just the first endpoint. The next will be, do patients have less recurrence of their disease? And then ultimately, do they survive longer? But isn't that fantastic that you can maybe make the tumor smaller, do a lesser operation, leave more lung because, we worry about, the effects that might have, on breathing and so forth. But also to get the cancer when you can see it, the tumor is there, knock it out, and then do the surgery. So I would predict we're going to see many more trials like that, as well as more trials in the adjuvant setting. The problem we have is it's working in both settings. There are so many variables and so many trials. It's going to mean that there should be a trial at every center right now for someone with this disease, because that is the cutting edge. And the important thing, patients tolerated it well. It was feasible. It could be done. In any trial, you always have to ask, if you're adding something, are you making patients sicker? Are they going to have issues? And this trial showed that it was quite well tolerated. So I was very excited by that, seeing those data just a couple of weeks ago. We're fighting an opponent that is relentless, but we're better. And we have science on our side. And I would say, as we're talking about, we need to use all the different modalities, chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation. But now we have the immunotherapy, we have the targeted agents, we have the targeting KRAS, and it's how to combine these things together. And the thing that I've learned, and we have a large grant at Yale called a SPORE, a specialized program of research excellence. And I actually was just meeting with some of my team this afternoon. We need to now we're at a very important turning point in this disease, because we have all these tools, we have all these drugs, but we can't just mix things together willy-nilly. We're going to have to understand, if a cancer is not responding to immunotherapy, why? Is it because the immune cells aren't getting to the tumor? Is there a new resistance mechanism? And I would say, with everything we're talking about tonight, the diagnosis, the expert clinicians and treatment team, and then all these drugs, we need to figure out how to put it all together for each person. So that's happening. And it is a war, because you have to decide, when do you use this weapon versus that weapon? How do you combine things together?
Can you talk a little bit, we touched on it, but can you talk a little bit more deeply about who should be receiving immunotherapy? How do we know who should be receiving immunotherapy and what those treatments look like?
So we have some people now with lung cancer who are alive and doing great, from 2010, who got immunotherapy. People who had the squamous lung cancer with no actionable mutations, meaning nothing that we could treat with one of these new targeted drugs, 3 prior chemotherapies, who got these drugs and did amazingly well. There's no doubt, I've seen it many times myself. I've been involved in a number of the trials. Immunotherapy is just incredible how well it can work. The thing about it is, it works that well only about 15 to 20% of the time. So 1 in 5, maybe a bit less. We still don't know exactly who those 1 in 5 are from the very beginning. We do know that there's something called PD-L1, and if it's high, that's part of the story. But even if the PD-L1, the marker, is way up high, still only half those patients see their tumors shrink. So we have to figure out, what about the other half? And then for those that have the PD-L1 in the intermediate range, we're doing combinations with chemotherapy. We have different immunotherapy combinations. It works, but to variable degrees. So what I would tell people is, yes, you want to ask, is my tumor amenable to immunotherapy? First, I would say, is it amenable to one of the targeted therapies? Because if someone has one of those, you should use it first. But the immunotherapy is something one wants to consider. It's not without its side effects, but it can be pretty well tolerated under the right guidance and very careful scrutiny. But we're now in the era where we have to then take this to the next level. And what you'll see at many sites in clinical trials are combinations. This is what we're doing in our lung master protocol. Combinations of immunotherapies, or an immunotherapy plus a chemotherapy, different things to try to then figure out how to overcome the resistance. But I will tell you that I would never have thought when I started out in the field in 1994 we'd see this type of effect with a drug. So it tells us that it can work. I'm sure there are many people on this line who are on immunotherapy and are benefiting. We still have many who can't benefit, or many of the people with the targeted drugs, the immunotherapy doesn't work as well actually in that setting. So we still have a long way to go, but we've seen the light at the end of the tunnel. It's just a very long tunnel. We first started using targeted therapy in 1997, and we still are trying to figure out how to optimize it. It's moving to the earlier stages. Immunotherapy has only been with us really as standard of care for 5-6 years, and we haven't started to personalize it yet. So my prediction is, and actually you have me wanting to get back to work now, we have to figure out how we're going to personalize immunotherapy. The same way we're looking at markers for targeted therapy, I would contest that the top centers, and then hopefully it gets spread throughout the country, are going to look at tumor markers and immune cell markers. Create an equation and say, this is the cocktail of drugs one needs. Don't forget all this cell therapy, the CAR T cells and the T cell infusions. There's so much opportunity, but we still have to do the work. That's why we need the clinical trials. We need to support research, and but these trials are being done. But there is hope, and it's great that these things are all happening.
Do you know of any people out there that are working on repurposing drugs from other cancers that have the same markers as lung cancer?
Well, the repurposing of drugs, many drugs in the old days without personalization, were considered failures. And now I think, one of the things we talked about was sequencing. So yes, I think that if we, why if you have 1% of patients with lung cancer have a genetic abnormality, let's say it's PI3 kinase, which we treat in breast cancer, why can't we find that small group of patients? Because there are 1.5 million patients with lung cancer in the world each year. So yes, I think we have to look at all the other tumor types. It's funny though, or it's concerning that sometimes a drug that works in one tumor type against the target might not work in the other, just like the EGFR in lung cancer doesn't work as well in other tumor types. But yes, I think we have to keep our eyes wide open. We have at Yale, by the way, a precision medicine tumor board every week. So we can't discuss every patient's case, but it's by referral, and we'll discuss 4 to 6 situations each week and look at the mutation, no matter what the tumor. So we don't care whether it's lung, breast, colon. We care what's driving that tumor, and then we have the experts, both clinically and also from the lab, the people that do the DNA sequencing, come together and suggest what would be the best drugs. And again, repurposing is something that we can certainly do, Bonnie.
Can you explain to the folks watching live and those that will come back to watch post live what a tumor board is?
Yeah, so see, my hair is getting gray. I'm as experienced as they get in lung cancer, and I still, whenever I have a difficult situation, I always refer to the tumor board. Why? Because I don't know everything, and I need to work in a multimodality way. And what a tumor board is, it's basically all the physicians and caregivers, the social workers, the nurses, the team gets together. It's once a week, sometimes more, and they discuss the surgeons, the radiation oncologists, the medical oncologists, the pulmonary oncologists, the pulmonologists, and then the people expert in all the different drugs, and the radiologists, the pathologists, and we give the tumor and the patient a fresh look. And then we say, because a lot of these decisions, what stage is a tumor? Is this lymph node positive or not? We talked about the rebiopsy. What drug should we use? It's not straightforward. So this is bringing together the group to reach consensus. We do it at Yale, just for our practice at our main site. But think about how important it might be if you're someone who's going to a distant site. It's more convenient. It's more convenient for your family. It's more convenient for you. In fact, that's where you should go. We should bring all these drugs and therapies to the community, but it's nice if it's all reviewed in a central way. And tumor boards are just so critical. And, we actually have, at a place like Yale, we run 15 to 16 tumor boards a week, for each different tumor. And we're now actually probably going to have to add a second lung tumor board because, again, we want to review these cases. So I saw a patient today and I said, Monday morning at 7:30, my fellow, I usually work with a trainee, we're going to present this at our tumor board and then we'll get back to you. And it's it's also where you train people and the doctors and the nurses, everyone learns. So I would say you definitely want things to be reviewed at a tumor board. And most places now are doing that. Multimodality care, that's the key. And that includes the mind too. You want to have your social workers, you want to have your support groups. The support group is part of that tumor board as well. One of the things that I'm very excited about now is, I'm in Connecticut, which is, you go up in the 95 all the way from New York all the way to Boston. We have 15 sites now where we're treating patients. And what we're doing now is we're putting multimodality care at every site. So if you go to Greenwich and you're at a Yale site, you have a surgeon, a radiation oncologist, a medical oncologist who have all been at that tumor board. If you go up to Hartford, you have the same thing. That's the way, it's important to constantly ratchet up the level of care, do the sequencing and to learn and to bring the new therapies and adopt them as quickly as possible. So that's what's happening. I see it happening across the entire country. And I'm very excited to be part of it. Even I walk across the hall and ask advice when I'm in the clinic. It's become, and it's good. We have so many options now. You want a thoracic surgeon who just does lung surgery, not cardiac surgery. You want a radiation oncologist, who is focused on the lungs because, again, the field is getting more and more specialized, and that's good. But, then if you find that it's a therapy that can be delivered closer to home, people should get their therapy closer to home because that's more convenient for them, their family. People have to work. And look, there are a lot of people with cancer. They can't all come to the big city. So you have to work as a collaboration.
Exactly. And they can help in clinical trials too, and do the needed blood draws and testing that are required for the clinical trial, but they don't have to leave their home arena to do it. They can be done in the
Right.
community center and those things sent off to the academic center.
We
So
did that, Bonnie. If we put, in our best year a few years ago, we put about a quarter of our patients on at our community sites. So you want the trials to be running because if someone has to think about a clinical trial, it means that they really have to be up on all the best standards of care. So it improves the practice just because you have those trials open. But then, of course, it might be, the patient who 10, 11 years ago got on the nivolumab as the first clinical trial. She's still doing well. So clinical trials can, and now more than ever, we're picking drugs better and they are having great effect.
yeah, but we have to bring the trials to the patient where they live and where they're
Absolutely.
treated, instead of making them fly across the United States, where they're leaving their family. They can't leave their work. It just makes all the sense in the world to bring it to them rather than make them find you. You
Well,
find them.
that's the lung map idea. A trial that's open at 700 plus sites, and in the community, with access to profiling. That's exactly the goal. And in fact, when we started that trial, I don't know if you know Ellen Siegel, and Friends of Cancer Research, but she was working very closely with Rick Pazder and Janet Woodcock and the FDA. That was the goal of this, to get drugs to where the patients are.
So the last thing I want to talk about, which is, in my opinion, based on what I hear on the streets, is palliative care. Quite often, when folks hear or their healthcare team, someone from their team tries to discuss palliative care with them, often they associate it with hospice as opposed to this sort of supportive nature. Dr. Herbst, can you talk a little bit about palliative care and why it's an important piece of the puzzle when patients are going through treatment?
Oh, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. Palliative care is an important thing to bring in as early as possible. In fact, studies have shown that, if you bring palliative care early, it actually improves the outcome and survival in lung cancer. very often, especially now that we have these therapies that really work, it takes some time for them to work. Immunotherapy has a delayed, activity. Surgery sometimes can have, you have to do a big surgical procedure. Sometimes people have some side effects. So it is important to treat symptoms and allow people to feel strong and well as they're going through their therapy. So we actually have a very active palliative care program at Yale. Sometimes we even hire physicians who are both boarded in palliative care and oncology, working in this space, because you want to treat the symptoms. Let's say we talked about ADAURA tonight, and someone's getting Osimertinib, Tagrisso, for 3 years. Even someone might have some issues with fatigue. Someone might have a dry mouth. They might have some rash. These things need to be dealt with very early. Supportive care can help with that. So you're treating someone with immunotherapy, which can result in I think cure people. I actually think we're curing people with immunotherapy, but sometimes you have to get people through some processes where they might have skin or pulmonary or other issues. Of course, you might attack that with a pulmonologist, but supportive care, palliative care can be that important. So I really think palliative care, physical care, and then let's not forget the social worker and the mental care as well, support groups. One of the things I love most is every November, I bring together my multimodality team at Yale, and we have a lung cancer awareness event. And we're in the auditorium, and maybe this year we'll have to be outside on a field because they might not let us in the auditorium. But we're taking questions, and we're seeing how people are coping with this, and people get up and share their stories. So I think palliative supportive care is just so important in oncology. The oncologists and palliative care doctors work side by side. And as I say, I have several palliative care doctors. I have 2 now in my department of oncology, who work side by side with us.
I want to be mindful of time and ask Dr. Herbst if he has any final thoughts.
Well, I'll just say it's an honor to be here. I know I've seen it. I've taken care of many patients over the years. I've had family with this disease. It's been great to see the progress, but we're not stopping now. There's a lot more work to do, getting those that don't have access to care, these new therapies, but also continuing to find ways to treat the resistance. And I'm dedicated, and my team are. But we couldn't do it without groups like yours, and GoTo, and creating awareness, supporting patients, and helping them to find us so that we can run clinical trials and bring the level of care as high as we possibly can. So thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night, and we'll see you soon.
Oh, I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.